A photograph sits in an archive, untouched for over a century. At first glance, it seems unremarkable. A black family dressed in their finest clothes, standing before a wooden house somewhere in rural Alabama. The year is 1905. The image is slightly faded, the edges worn by time. A father, a mother, 3 children. All of them looking directly at the camera with expressions of quiet dignity. But something in this photograph is not what it seems. Look closer. Look at the youngest child. A boy, no more than 5 years old, standing at the front of the family. Now look at his hand. He is holding something. Something small. Something metallic. For decades, no one noticed. The photograph passed through collections, was filed away, forgotten, until one researcher decided to zoom in. What she discovered would unravel a secret that the family had hidden in plain sight for over 100 years. A secret about chains, about freedom, and about the unbreakable bond between generations. This is the story of what that child's hand was holding, and why it changes everything. If you love stories that reveal the hidden truths of history, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. You won't want to miss what comes next. The humidity inside the Alabama State Archives was oppressive, even with the aging air conditioning unit rattling in the corner. Dr. Ruth, a historian specializing in post-Reconstruction African-American communities, wiped the sweat from her brow and turned another page of the deteriorating catalog. She had spent 3 weeks buried in boxes of unclaimed photographs, images donated by estates, churches, and historical societies over the past century. Most were unlabeled. Many were damaged. All of them were waiting to have their stories told. It was tedious work. Photograph after photograph of unnamed faces, unknown places, fragments of lives that had slipped through the cracks of recorded history. And then she found it. The photograph was mounted on thick cardboard, the kind used by professional studios in the early 20th century. The image itself was remarkably well preserved. A family of 5 posed in front of a modest but well-kept wooden house. The father stood tall on the left, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. She sat in a chair, her posture elegant despite the simplicity of her surroundings. Behind them, 2 older children, a teenage girl and a boy of perhaps 12, stood with their hands clasped in front of them. But it was the youngest child who caught Ruth's attention. A boy, small and serious-faced, stood at the front of the group. His clothes were clean and pressed, a tiny bow tie fastened at his collar. He looked directly at the camera with eyes that seemed far older than his years. Ruth leaned closer. There was something in his right hand. She reached for her magnifying glass and held it over the image. The object was small, dark, metallic. It could have been a toy. It could have been anything. But something about the way the child held it, deliberately, almost ceremonially, made Ruth's heart beat faster. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line, "The Williams family, Hale County, Alabama, 1905. No first names, no context, just a family name and a place. Ruth stared at the photograph for a long moment. In her 20 years of archival work, she had learned to recognize when an image was more than it appeared, when a photograph was not just a record, but a message. This was one of those photographs. She carefully placed the image in a protective sleeve and made a note in her research journal. Williams family portrait, 1905. Child holding unidentified object. Requires further investigation. She had no idea that this single photograph would consume the next 2 years of her life, or that the answer to its mystery would reach back through generations of pain, resilience, and a secret past from parent to child in silence. The next morning, Ruth arrived at the university's imaging laboratory before anyone else. She had not slept well. The photograph had stayed with her through the night, the image of that child's hand refusing to leave her mind. Dr. Samuel, the lab's director and an expert in photographic restoration, met her with his usual skepticism. He had seen too many historians convinced they had found something extraordinary, only to discover that the mysterious object was a button or a piece of lint. "Let's see what you've got," he said, adjusting his glasses. Ruth handed him the photograph. He examined it briefly, shrugged, and placed it under the high-resolution scanner. The machine hummed to life. Within minutes, a digital image appeared on the monitor. Every grain, every shadow, every microscopic detail rendered in stunning clarity. Samuel zoomed in on the child's hand. The room went silent. The object was not a toy. It was not a coin or a button or a random piece of metal. It was a key, but not just any key. This was an old key, far older than the photograph itself. The design was crude, handmade with a thick shaft and heavy teeth. It was the kind of key that had not been manufactured for decades by the time this photograph was taken. "That's antebellum," Samuel whispered. "That key is from before the Civil War." Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. A key from the era of slavery, held in the hand of a child in 1905. The child would have been 2 generations removed from bondage. His grandparents, perhaps even his parents, would have been born into chains. Why would a family keep such an object? And why would they place it in a child's hand for a formal portrait? Ruth magnified the image further. The key was attached to a thin cord or ribbon, as if it had been worn around someone's neck. And there, barely visible on the shaft, were markings, letters or numbers too faded to read. "Can you enhance those markings?" Ruth asked. Samuel worked the software for several minutes. Slowly, the shapes became clearer. 2 letters emerged from the corrosion. J.W. Initials. Someone's initials. Ruth's mind raced. The family name on the back of the photograph was Williams, J.W. Could this be an ancestor, a grandfather, a great-grandfather? She looked at the child's face again. He was not simply holding the key. He was presenting it. His arm was extended slightly forward, the key visible and prominent. This was not an accident. This was intentional. The family had wanted this key to be seen. They had wanted it recorded. They had hidden a message in plain sight, waiting for someone, someday, to understand. And Ruth was determined to be that someone. Ruth began her investigation in the only place she could, Hale County, Alabama. The county had been at the heart of the Black Belt, named for its rich, dark soil that had made it prime cotton territory before the Civil War. It had also been home to some of the largest slave plantations in the state. By 1905, 40 years after emancipation, Hale County's black population had built churches, schools, and communities. But the shadow of the past remained. Many families still lived on the same land where their ancestors had been enslaved, now as sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Ruth drove through the county on a gray November afternoon. The fields were bare, the cotton long since harvested. Old wooden houses dotted the landscape, some abandoned, some still standing. She stopped first at the county courthouse, a crumbling brick building that somehow still held records dating back to the 1830s. The clerk, an elderly woman named Della, looked at Ruth with suspicion when she asked about the Williams family. "Williams is a common name around here," Della said. "You'll need more than that." Ruth showed her the photograph. Della studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "That house?" she said finally. "I know that house, or what's left of it. It's out on the old Thornton plantation property, about 8 miles east." Ruth's pulse quickened. "The Thornton plantation?" Della nodded slowly. "Big place, back in the day. The Thorntons owned hundreds of people before the war. After emancipation, some of the freed families stayed on as workers. Some of them took the name Williams. Do you know why they chose that name?" Della was quiet for a moment. "There was a man," she said. "My grandmother used to talk about him. They called him Joseph. Joseph Williams. He was the first in his family to be free. The story goes that he walked off the Thornton plantation the day the Union soldiers came and never looked back. Joseph Williams. J.W. Ruth felt the pieces beginning to connect. The initials on the key, the family name, the location. "Is there anyone still alive who might remember the family?" Ruth asked. Della thought for a moment. "There's a woman, lives out past the old church. Name is Miriam. She must be 90 years old by now, but her mind is sharp. Her grandmother was a Williams. She might know something." Ruth thanked Della and drove east, toward the remains of the Thornton plantation, and the woman who might hold the answers she was seeking. The road was long and empty. The sky hung low and gray, and somewhere in the distance, the past was waiting. Miriam lived in a small white house at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by pecan trees that had been planted long before she was born. Ruth parked her car and walked up the wooden steps to the porch, where an elderly woman sat in a rocking chair, wrapped in a quilted blanket despite the mild afternoon. Miriam's eyes were clouded with age, but they fixed on Ruth with startling intensity. "You're the one asking about the Williams family," she said. It was not a question. Ruth nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'm a historian. I found a photograph, and I'm trying to understand its story." Miriam gestured to a chair beside her. "Sit down. Let me see this photograph." Ruth handed her the image. Miriam held it close to her face, studying it for what felt like an eternity. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression remained calm. "I know these people," she said finally. "This man here, his name was Abraham. He was my grandmother's cousin, and this woman, his wife, was called Nettie. They had 3 children. The oldest girl was Della Mae. The boy in back was Thomas, and the little one in front—" She paused, her finger resting on the child's image. "That's Samuel. Little Samuel. He died young. Fever took him when he was about 8 or 9. Broke his mama's heart." Ruth felt a wave of sadness. The serious-eyed child in the photograph had only a few years left to live when this image was captured. "Do you know what he's holding in his hand?" Ruth asked gently. Miriam was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know exactly what that is. My grandmother told me about it when I was a little girl, made me promise to never forget." She looked at Ruth with an expression that was both fierce and fragile. "That key belonged to Joseph Williams, Abraham's grandfather. My great-great-grandfather. Joseph was born a slave on the Thornton plantation. He wore chains for the first 30 years of his life. She paused, her breath catching. And that key, that little piece of metal in that child's hand, is the key that unlocked those chains, the key to Joseph's freedom. Ruth felt the air leave her lungs. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed, hearing the weight of history in Miriam's voice, was almost overwhelming. How did he get it? Ruth asked. Miriam smiled, but there was no joy in it. That, she said, is a story that takes some telling. Miriam settled deeper into her chair, her eyes gazing at something far beyond the pecan trees and the quiet afternoon. Joseph was born around 1832, she began. His mother was a field worker on the Thornton plantation. His father was sold away before Joseph could even walk. That was the way of things back then. Families torn apart like they were nothing. She shook her head slowly. Joseph grew up strong, too strong for his own good, some said. The Thorntons used him for the hardest labor, clearing land, building fences, hauling timber, and when he got older, they started hiring him out to other plantations during busy seasons. Ruth listened intently, her recorder running, capturing every word. But Joseph was smart, smarter than they knew. He taught himself to read in secret, stole a primer from the big house and hid it in the woods. He learned about the world beyond Hale County. He learned about the North, about freedom. Miriam paused, her weathered hands gripping the armrests of her chair. In 1859, Joseph tried to run. He made it nearly 50 miles before the patrollers caught him. They brought him back in chains, heavy iron shackles around his wrists and ankles. Old Man Thornton was furious. He had Joseph whipped in front of the whole plantation as a warning. Her voice hardened. But he didn't break Joseph. Nothing could break that man. He just got quieter, more careful. He started planning again, waiting for his chance. And then the war came, Ruth said softly. Miriam nodded. The war came, and everything changed. By 1865, the Union Army was moving through Alabama. One morning, a group of soldiers rode onto the Thornton plantation. They told the enslaved people they were free, that the war was over, that they could go wherever they pleased. She leaned forward, her voice dropping low. Most people didn't know what to do. They'd been told they were property their whole lives. But Joseph knew exactly what to do. He walked straight to the overseer's cabin, where they kept the keys to the chains and the locks. The overseer had already fled. Joseph found the key that had locked his shackles all those years ago. He took it, and he walked off that plantation without looking back. Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes. He kept the key. He kept it until the day he died, Miriam confirmed. Said it was the most important thing he owned, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. It meant he was a man. It meant his children would never wear chains. It meant the Thorntons didn't own him anymore, and they never would again. After the war, Joseph Williams built a new life. He married a woman named Clara, who had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. Together, they claimed a small plot of land in Hale County, 20 acres purchased with money Joseph earned working as a blacksmith. They had 4 children. The eldest, a son named Abraham, was born in 1871, the first generation of the Williams family born into freedom. Miriam's voice softened as she continued the story. Joseph never let his children forget where they came from. Every Sunday after church, he would gather them together and tell them the stories. The stories of his mother, sold away when he was young, the stories of the fields, the whips, the chains, and the story of the day he walked free. She gestured toward the photograph still in her lap, and he showed them the key. He told them it was their inheritance, more valuable than any land or money. It was proof that their family had survived, that they had endured, that they had earned their freedom through suffering and strength. Ruth understood now why the family had placed the key in the child's hand for the portrait. They wanted to record it, she said. They wanted future generations to see. Miriam nodded. Photography was expensive back then. A family portrait was a rare thing, something you might do once in a lifetime. Abraham and Nettie saved for months to have that picture taken, and when the day came, they made sure little Samuel was holding the key. But why Samuel? Why the youngest? Miriam smiled sadly. Because Samuel was the future. He was the 3rd generation born free. By putting the key in his hand, they were saying, "This is yours now. This history, this memory, this freedom. It belongs to you and to everyone who comes after you." Ruth looked at the photograph with new eyes. The formal poses, the dignified expressions, the child's extended hand. "Haus tu motrice?" It was all deliberate. Every element of the image had been carefully arranged to preserve and transmit a message across time. "What happened to the key after Samuel died?" Ruth asked. Miriam's expression grew somber. "It passed to his brother Thomas, and then to Thomas's daughter, and then to her son. It was kept in a wooden box, wrapped in cloth, hidden away where no one outside the family would ever find it." She paused. "The key is still in the family. I know exactly where it is." Ruth could hardly believe what she was hearing. The key still exists? Miriam nodded slowly. It's been passed down for 5 generations. It's in a house not far from here. Belongs to my nephew, George. He's the keeper now. Ruth's mind raced with possibilities. If the key still existed, if it could be examined and documented, it would be an extraordinary piece of evidence. A direct physical link to the era of slavery and emancipation? Would George be willing to speak with me? Ruth asked. Miriam studied her for a long moment as if weighing something important. George is a private man. He doesn't trust easily. The family has always kept this story to ourselves. We learned a long time ago that the world doesn't always want to hear what we have to say. Ruth understood. The history of black families in America was filled with stories that had been ignored, dismissed, or stolen. Trust was not given freely. I don't want to take anything from your family, Ruth said carefully. I only want to help tell the story, if you want it told. The decision is yours. Miriam rocked slowly in her chair, thinking. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the porch. Finally, she spoke. Come back tomorrow. I'll talk to George. If he agrees, I'll take you to see the key. Ruth thanked her and drove back to her motel as the sun set over the empty fields. She spent the night unable to sleep, her mind replaying everything Miriam had told her. The plantation, the chains, Joseph's walk to freedom. The key passed down through generations like a sacred relic. And the photograph, the beautiful, deliberate photograph that had preserved the secret for over a century. The next morning, Ruth returned to Miriam's house. The old woman was waiting on the porch, dressed in her Sunday clothes. George agreed, she said, but he has conditions. He wants to meet you first. He wants to know what kind of person you are before he shows you anything. Ruth nodded. I understand. They drove together down a series of winding back roads until they reached a modest brick house surrounded by farmland. A tall man in his 60s stood on the front porch, his arms crossed, his expression guarded. This was George, the current keeper of Joseph Williams' key. George did not smile when Ruth approached. He shook her hand firmly but said nothing, his eyes assessing her with careful scrutiny. Aunt Miriam says you're a historian, he said finally. Says you found a picture of our family? Ruth showed him the photograph. George studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I've seen this picture before, he said. There's a copy in my mother's old Bible, but I never knew there was another one out there. He handed the photograph back and looked at Ruth directly. What exactly do you want? Ruth chose her words carefully. I want to understand the story behind this photograph. Your aunt told me about Joseph Williams, about the key. I believe this image is significant. I believe it deserves to be seen and understood. George was silent for a long moment. Then he turned and walked into the house without a word. Ruth looked at Miriam, uncertain. The old woman simply nodded and gestured for her to follow. The interior of the house was modest, but immaculately clean. Family photographs lined the walls, and generations of faces spanning more than a century. George led them to a small room at the back of the house that appeared to be a study. He opened a closet and pulled out a wooden box, old and worn but carefully maintained. He set it on the desk and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was the key. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. It was exactly as it appeared in the photograph. Heavy, crude, handmade. The iron was dark with age, but the teeth were still clearly defined. And there, on the shaft, barely visible but unmistakable, were the initials, J.W. This is it, George said quietly. This is the key that unlocked my great-great-great-grandfather's chains. It's been in our family for 160 years. Ruth felt tears streaming down her face. She made no move to wipe them away. May I photograph it? She asked. George nodded slowly. Photograph it. Document it. Tell the story if you want. But the key stays with us. It will never leave this family. Ruth agreed without hesitation. She spent the next hour carefully photographing the key from every angle, documenting its dimensions, its markings, its weight in George's hands. When she finished, George wrapped the key again and returned it to its box. My mother used to say that this key is worth more than anything money can buy, he said, because it's proof. Proof that we were here, proof that we survived, proof that no matter what they did to us, they couldn't destroy us. Over the following months, Ruth worked tirelessly to verify and document the story. She found records of the Thornton plantation in county archives, inventories that listed enslaved people by first name only, including a Joseph, valued at $800 in 1855. She found Union Army records documenting the liberation of enslaved people in Hale County in 1865. She found land deeds showing Joseph Williams' purchase of 20 acres in 1869. Every piece of evidence confirmed what Miriam had told her, but the most powerful confirmation came from the key itself. Ruth brought a metallurgist to examine it, a specialist in antebellum ironwork. He confirmed that the key was consistent with locks and shackles manufactured in the 1840s and 1850s. The craftsmanship was crude. the metal composition typical of southern ironworks of the period. It was authentic. The key was real. Ruth also discovered something else. In the archives of a local church, she found a handwritten account by a minister who had known Joseph Williams in the 1880s. The minister described Joseph as a man of remarkable dignity and quiet strength, who carried with him always a small iron key, which he said was his most precious possession. The minister had asked Joseph why he kept the key. Joseph's answer was recorded in the minister's journal. "Because my children must never forget. They must never forget what we endured. They must never forget what it cost. And they must never forget that we are free." Ruth sat alone in the archive, reading those words again and again. Joseph Williams had wanted his story to be remembered. He had placed the key in his great-grandson's hand specifically so that someday someone would see it and ask questions. And now, more than a century later, those questions had finally been asked and answered. Ruth knew what she had to do. She would write the story. She would publish the photograph. She would make sure that Joseph Williams and the family that had preserved his memory would never be forgotten again. But first, she had to return to Hale County one more time. Ruth returned to George's house on a warm spring afternoon. The pecan trees were blooming, and the air smelled of fresh earth and new growth. This time, she was not alone. She had arranged for George and Miriam to meet with representatives from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The museum wanted to include the Williams family story in an upcoming exhibition on post-emancipation life. George had agreed to loan the original photograph, but not the key. The key would remain with the family, as it always had. Instead, the museum would display a detailed replica alongside the photograph and the documented history of Joseph Williams. The meeting was emotional. George spoke about his mother, who had told him the story of the key when he was a boy. Miriam spoke about her grandmother, who had been a child when Joseph Williams died in 1902. Each generation had kept the story alive, passing it down like a flame that could never be extinguished. When the museum representatives left, Ruth stayed behind. She sat with George and Miriam on the front porch as the sun began to set. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me, for sharing your family's story." George looked at the photograph in his hands, the image of Abraham and Nettie, of Della Mae and Thomas, and of little Samuel holding the key. "My ancestors put that key in Samuel's hand for a reason," he said. "They wanted someone to see it. They wanted the world to know that we were here, that we mattered, that we survived." He looked at Ruth with an expression she had never seen before, something between pride and sorrow and hope. "It took 118 years, he said, "but someone finally saw it. Someone finally understood." Ruth nodded, unable to speak. Miriam reached over and took her hand. "Joseph would have been proud," the old woman said. "He always believed that the truth would come out eventually. He just had to wait for the right person to find it." As Ruth drove away from Hale County that evening, she thought about the photograph and everything it represented. A family, a key, a secret hidden in plain sight, and a man named Joseph Williams, who had walked out of bondage with nothing but his freedom and a small piece of iron, and who had made sure that his story would never be forgotten. The photograph now had a voice, and it was speaking across the generations at last.